You did everything you were told to do. You followed the path step by step. You stayed within the lines, avoided unnecessary risks, chose stability over uncertainty. And yet somewhere along the way, a quiet discomfort began to grow inside you. Not loud enough to disrupt your life, but persistent enough that you could never fully ignore it. A subtle feeling that despite doing everything right, something about your life does not feel like it belongs to you. As if you are living inside a structure that was designed before you ever had the chance to decide who you are meant to become. From the beginning, direction was given to you before awareness was developed. Expectations were set before identity was formed. And without realizing it, you began to build your life on foundations that were never examined, only accepted. Because when something is repeated often enough, it stops feeling like instruction and starts feeling like truth. And once it feels like truth, you no longer question it. You organize your decisions around it. You measure your progress by it. And eventually you define yourself through it. You learned early that approval comes from compliance. That recognition follows conformity. That safety lies in predictability. And over time, those ideas settled into your thinking so deeply that they began to shape not only what you do, but how you think, how you interpret opportunity, how you define success, and most importantly, how you limit yourself without even realizing it. Because the most effective limitation is not imposed from the outside. It is accepted from within. At some point, the question shifted without you noticing. You stopped asking what you truly want and started asking how to succeed within what has already been defined. And that shift is where the path begins to narrow. Because once you accept the structure, you begin to optimize within it instead of questioning it. You become efficient, consistent, reliable, but all of that efficiency is directed toward a life that may not reflect your actual potential. What makes this even more difficult to recognize is that nothing appears broken on the surface. Your life functions. Your responsibilities are met. Your environment is stable, and from the outside, everything seems aligned. But internally, something remains unsettled. Not because you lack discipline, not because you lack effort, but because effort applied in the wrong direction will never create fulfillment. It only creates repetition. You begin to notice that time moves, but nothing expands. Days turn into weeks, weeks into years, and while progress appears to be happening, it feels contained, controlled, limited to a predefined range, as if no matter how much energy you invest, the outcome never exceeds a certain boundary. And that boundary is not physical. It is conceptual. It exists in how you have been conditioned to think about what is possible for you. This is where most people stop, not because they are satisfied, but because they are accustomed. And familiarity has a way of disguising limitation as normality. When something is repeated long enough, it loses its ability to be questioned. And once it is no longer questioned, it becomes permanent by default. Not because it cannot be changed, but because no one attempts to change it, but something within you does not fully agree with this, even if it is quiet, even if it only appears in moments of stillness. There is a part of you that recognizes the gap between what you are living and what you are capable of becoming, a part that cannot be convinced that this is all there is. No matter how many times you are told that this is just how life works, that recognition is not random. It is not unrealistic. It is the result of something deeper than logic, something that has not been conditioned in the same way as your habits, something that still remembers what it feels like to think without limitation, to imagine without restriction, to see possibility without immediately filtering it through what is considered realistic. The tension you feel is not confusion. It is contrast. The contrast between the life you are living and the life you sense is possible. And that contrast does not exist to frustrate you. It exists to reveal something. Because without contrast, there is no awareness. And without awareness, there is no change. What you have been given is a path, but a path is not a destiny. It is only a direction, and a direction can be followed, adjusted, or completely abandoned depending on whether it aligns with where you intend to go. But if you never question the path, you will mistake it for something permanent, something fixed, something that cannot be altered. The truth is far less restrictive than you have been led to believe, because the structure you are operating within may guide your actions, but it does not define your potential. It may influence your thinking, but it does not own it. And once you begin to separate what you have been given from what you can choose, something shifts in a way that cannot easily be reversed. You begin to see patterns instead of isolated events. You begin to recognize that many of your decisions have been influenced more by expectation than by intention. And that realization carries weight, because it removes the illusion that your life is simply unfolding. It reveals that it has been shaped, directed, and maintained through repeated acceptance. And once you see that clearly, even for a moment, returning to unconscious living becomes difficult, because awareness creates tension, and tension demands resolution. Not immediately, not dramatically, but inevitably, you are no longer just moving through a system. You are observing it, and observation changes your relationship to it. Because what you can see, you can question, and what you can question, you can eventually change, even if that change begins quietly. Even if it starts with nothing more than a refusal to continue blindly. That shift does not need to be visible to anyone else. It does not require immediate action, but it marks a point that matters. Because from that moment forward, the life you were handed no longer feels absolute. Nothing in your life was taken by force. And that is precisely why it was taken so completely. Because when something is taken violently, it creates resistance. But when it is taken gradually, logically, and under the disguise of responsibility, it becomes something you participate in willingly, something you protect, something you even feel proud of, without ever realizing what it has cost you over time. And this is where the deception becomes almost impossible to detect, because it does not feel like loss. It feels like progress. You were given a path that sounded reasonable, even admirable. Work hard, stay consistent, build stability, be patient, and eventually everything will make sense. And because each part of that message contains a fragment of truth, it is rarely questioned as a whole. Yet what was never made clear is what all of that effort is actually building, who truly benefits from your consistency, and whether the direction you are following was ever chosen by you or simply accepted before you had the awareness to decide. So the process begins quietly and unfolds over years. You give your time first, because time feels abundant when you are young. It feels like something you can invest without urgency, something that will always be there. So you place it into systems that promise a future return, always preparing, always building, always moving towards something that seems just ahead, but never fully arrives in the way you imagined. And as this pattern continues, your energy naturally follows. Long days of effort, focus directed toward goals that are not entirely your own, solving problems that do not expand your life but maintain someone else's structure. And because this effort is consistent, because it is expected, because it is normalized, it never feels like something is being taken. It feels like something you are supposed to do. Then, without any clear moment of transition, your attention becomes fragmented, not in one place, but across many, pulled in different directions by constant demands, constant input, constant noise, until the ability to sit, to think, to question, to reflect begins to weaken, not because you have lost it, but because it is no longer practiced. And when attention is scattered, clarity becomes difficult. And when clarity is absent, direction is easily influenced. This is how control operates at its most effective level. Not by restricting your movement, but by directing your focus. Because once your focus is directed, your decisions follow. And once your decisions follow, your life begins to take shape in a way that feels natural, even though it was never fully chosen. And this is why most people never recognize what has happened, because they are still active, still moving, still doing. And activity creates the illusion of control. Even when the direction of that activity is externally determined, you begin to measure your life by how busy you are rather than how aligned you are, by how much you are doing rather than what you are building. And this creates a pattern where effort is constant but expansion is limited, because effort without intention leads to repetition, not transformation. And over time, that repetition becomes your reality, predictable and stable, but confined within boundaries you did not consciously set. Look closely at how your goals are formed, how your ambitions take shape, how your definition of success was constructed. Because most of it did not originate from a moment of deep internal clarity. It was absorbed, repeated, reinforced through exposure, through environment, through what you were shown and told was valuable. And once those ideas were repeated often enough, they became familiar. And what is familiar becomes believable. And what is believed begins to guide behavior without needing to be questioned. This is the deeper layer of the deception. Not that you were forced into a life, but that you were guided into one in a way that felt like your own decision. You were shown what to aim for, what to value, what to consider realistic. And over time, those suggestions became internalized, shaping how you think, how you act, and what you allow yourself to pursue, until the line between what is yours and what was given to you becomes almost impossible to distinguish. Years pass within this structure. Patterns reinforce themselves. Your environment begins to reflect your habits. Your habits reinforce your identity, and your identity begins to define your future decisions, creating a loop that feels stable but rarely expands beyond a certain limit. And that limit is not physical. It is conceptual. It exists in what you believe is possible for you based on what has been repeatedly reinforced. And yet, even within this pattern, something does not fully settle. There is a quiet sense that despite all the movement, all the effort, all the consistency, something is missing, not in an emotional sense, but in a structural one, as if the life you are building is functional but not fully yours, as if the results you are producing do not reflect the full extent of what you are capable of creating. That feeling is not random. It is not weakness. It is not confusion. It is the result of misalignment between what you are doing and what you are meant to be doing. And misalignment cannot be permanently ignored. It can only be delayed, because the longer it exists, the more visible it becomes, not through dramatic events, but through subtle dissatisfaction that no amount of distraction can completely remove. And when that awareness begins to form, even slightly, the structure starts to lose its invisibility. Because once you see that your time has been directed, your energy has been consumed, and your attention has been fragmented, the idea that this is simply how life works becomes harder to accept without question. And that is the moment where something begins to shift internally, not in your external circumstances yet, but in how you relate to them. You begin to recognize that what has been given away can also be reclaimed, that what has been directed can also be redirected, and that the life you are living, while influenced by external systems, is not permanently controlled by them. Because influence is not ownership. And once you begin to see the difference, even for a moment, continuing in the same way no longer feels unconscious. What holds most people in place is not force. It is comfort, not the kind of comfort that feels luxurious, but the kind that feels familiar, predictable, manageable, the kind that quietly removes urgency, softens ambition, and replaces expansion with routine. Because when life becomes just comfortable enough, the desire to change weakens, not because the potential disappears, but because the pressure to act fades. And without pressure, growth slows until it eventually stops without ever being noticed. Comfort does not confront you, it adapts to you. It adjusts itself just enough to keep you satisfied but never fulfilled, giving you enough stability to stay but not enough purpose to expand. And over time, you begin to organize your decisions around maintaining that comfort, avoiding what feels uncertain, avoiding what feels difficult, avoiding anything that disrupts the structure you have become used to. And in doing so, you unknowingly train yourself to resist the very conditions that create transformation. Alongside comfort comes conditioning, and that conditioning often begins in environments designed to educate but structured to standardize, where the focus is not on developing independent thought but on reinforcing predictable behavior, where answers are rewarded more than questions, and conformity is encouraged more than originality. And while this creates order, it also creates limitation, because when you are trained to follow instructions consistently, you begin to lose the instinct to question them. You learn to seek correctness rather than clarity, to look for approval rather than direction, to measure yourself by external standards rather than internal alignment. And over time, this pattern becomes so natural that stepping outside of it feels uncomfortable, not because it is wrong, but because it is unfamiliar. And unfamiliarity is often interpreted as risk, even when it is the path to expansion. Then comes obligation in a more tangible form, not just psychological, but structural. Commitments that tie your future to decisions made in the past. Responsibilities that require consistency, not out of choice, but out of necessity. And while these commitments may appear logical, even necessary, they quietly reduce your flexibility, your ability to move freely, to take risks, to explore different directions. Because when your future is already partially allocated, your present decisions become constrained. This creates a situation where obedience is no longer philosophical. It becomes practical. You follow the path not because you fully believe in it, but because stepping outside of it carries consequences you feel unprepared to handle. And in that environment, stability becomes the priority, not because it is fulfilling, but because it is safer than uncertainty. The system does not need to force you to stay. It only needs to make leaving feel too costly. Comfort keeps you from wanting change. Conditioning shapes how you think about change. Obligation makes change difficult to act on. And when these elements combine, they create a structure that maintains itself without visible resistance. Because the limitation is no longer external. It is internalized, embedded in your habits, your preferences, your assumptions about what is possible and what is not. You begin to operate within these boundaries without questioning them. You adjust your expectations to match your environment. You redefine your ambitions to fit your current situation. And over time, this adjustment feels natural, even logical, because the mind seeks consistency. And when your environment remains the same, your thinking adapts to support it. This is how limitation becomes identity, not through a single decision, but through repeated alignment with what is available rather than what is possible. And once identity is shaped this way, change becomes difficult not because it is impossible, but because it requires you to step outside of who you believe you are. Most people do not resist growth because they lack ability. They resist it because it conflicts with their current identity. If you see yourself as someone who follows, creating feels unnatural. If you see yourself as someone who stays within limits, expanding feels risky. If you see yourself as someone who avoids uncertainty, pursuing something greater feels uncomfortable, and because identity operates beneath conscious awareness, these patterns continue without being directly challenged. You begin to justify your position, not as limitation, but as practicality. You tell yourself that this is realistic, that this is responsible, that this is simply how life works, and these explanations feel valid because they are reinforced by the people around you, by the environment you exist within, by the repetition of similar patterns across different lives. But repetition does not equal truth. It only creates familiarity, and familiarity, when left unexamined, becomes confinement. The deeper issue is not the structure itself, but the agreement you have formed with it, the acceptance of its boundaries as your own, the internalization of its limits as your identity. And once that agreement is in place, the system no longer needs to control you, because you are already operating within its expectations. Yet even within this, something remains unsettled. A part of you that does not fully accept the limits you have adapted to, a part that recognizes the difference between stability and stagnation, a part that senses that what you are capable of extends beyond what you are currently expressing. This part does not disappear, even when ignored. It remains present, sometimes quiet, sometimes stronger, but always there, waiting for recognition. And the moment you begin to question the boundaries, even slightly, they begin to lose their invisibility, because what is seen can no longer operate unconsciously, and what is recognized can eventually be changed. Even if that change begins with nothing more than a shift in how you see your own situation, because once you realize that comfort can limit, that conditioning can direct, and that obligation can confine, the idea that your current life is fixed becomes harder to accept without question. What keeps most people exactly where they are is not a lack of opportunity, not a lack of intelligence, not even a lack of desire, but a pattern so subtle that it rarely feels like a problem. A pattern of slowly choosing against themselves while convincing themselves they are being practical, responsible, realistic. And over time, that pattern becomes so consistent that it no longer feels like a choice. It feels like who they are. It begins in moments so small they seem insignificant. A decision delayed, an action avoided, a direction ignored. Not because it cannot be taken, but because it feels uncomfortable, uncertain, inconvenient. And instead of confronting that discomfort, you adjust your behavior to avoid it, telling yourself that you will act later, when things are clearer, when you feel more confident, when the timing is right. And each time you do this, something subtle shifts inside you, not in your ability, but in your trust in yourself. Self-betrayal is not a single event. It is a pattern of repeatedly ignoring what you know in favor of what feels easier. And every time this happens, the distance between your intention and your action grows. And the more that distance grows, the more your own voice begins to lose authority, until eventually your ideas, your goals, your intentions feel optional rather than necessary, something you think about rather than something you act on. You begin to notice that what you say you want and what you actually do are no longer aligned. And instead of confronting that misalignment directly, you explain it, justify it, soften it with logic that protects your current behavior. You tell yourself that the risk is too high, that the situation is complex, that you need more time. And while each of these reasons may contain some truth, they are often used not to solve the problem, but to delay it, to keep you in a position that feels manageable even if it is not fulfilling. This is where mental surrender takes hold, not as a dramatic collapse, but as a gradual adjustment, a slow lowering of standards, a quiet redefinition of what is acceptable, where instead of expanding your life to match your vision, You begin to shrink your vision to match your life. And this adjustment feels like relief because it removes pressure. It reduces tension. It makes your current situation easier to accept. But it also removes the very force that drives change. The mind adapts quickly to whatever is repeated. And when you consistently choose what is easier over what is necessary, your thinking begins to align with that pattern. You start to believe that this is simply how things are, that your limitations are fixed, that your current level is your natural level, and once that belief takes hold, it begins to direct your behavior automatically, reinforcing itself through every decision you make. Fear plays a role in this process, but not always in the obvious way. It is not always the fear of failure that holds you back. It is often the fear of disruption, the fear of stepping outside what is known, of challenging the identity you have built, of entering a space where outcomes are uncertain and control feels limited. And even if your current life is not fulfilling, it is predictable. And predictability creates a sense of safety that is difficult to abandon. So you remain where you are, not because you cannot leave, but because leaving requires you to confront not only external uncertainty, but internal resistance. And that resistance is reinforced by everything around you, by people who operate within the same patterns, who share the same limitations, who validate the same beliefs about what is realistic and what is not, creating an environment where staying feels normal and leaving feels extreme. Over time, this environment shapes your thinking, your expectations, your perception of what is possible, until your decisions are no longer made from a place of independent clarity, but from a framework that has been repeated and reinforced through constant exposure. And because that framework is shared, it feels correct, even when it limits you. And yet, despite all of this, there remains a contradiction that cannot be fully suppressed. A part of you that recognizes the gap between what you are living and what you are capable of becoming. A part that feels the discomfort not as a problem, but as a signal, an indication that something is not aligned, that something is being ignored. That signal does not disappear. It may become quieter, less frequent, easier to ignore, but it remains present, waiting for attention. And occasionally it becomes strong enough that you cannot fully dismiss it. In moments of reflection, in moments of frustration, in moments where the repetition of your life becomes impossible to overlook. In those moments, you are faced with something that does not look like a decision, but functions as one, a point where you either continue to justify your current pattern or begin to question it. Not externally, but internally, by examining the habits, the beliefs, the assumptions that have kept you in place. This is where responsibility shifts, because it becomes clear that while you may not have created the structure you are in, you have participated in maintaining it, not intentionally, but consistently, through choices that align with it. And once you see that clearly, the idea that you are completely constrained begins to lose its certainty, because what is maintained through participation can be changed through different participation. And that realization, once it takes hold, begins to alter how you see your own position. Everything you are experiencing right now is being directed by something you rarely stop to examine. Not your circumstances, not your environment, but the commands you have been repeating within your own mind. Because the mind does not operate randomly. It follows instruction. And whatever is repeated with enough consistency, enough emotion, enough certainty becomes a directive that shapes how you think, how you act, and ultimately what you produce over time. Most people assume their results are shaped by external factors, by opportunity, by timing, by luck. But beneath all of that lies something far more consistent and far more powerful. The internal dialogue that has been repeated so often it no longer feels like dialogue, it feels like truth. And once something feels like truth, It no longer needs to be questioned. It simply directs behavior in the background without resistance. Repetition is the mechanism that installs these commands. What you think repeatedly becomes familiar. What is familiar becomes believable. And what is believed begins to organize your actions automatically. This is how identity is formed, not in a single moment, but through accumulation, through the steady reinforcement of patterns that shape how you see yourself and what you expect from your life. And once identity is established, behavior follows it with remarkable consistency. If you repeatedly tell yourself that your limits are fixed, your actions will align with that belief. Not because you lack ability, but because your mind is executing the instruction it has been given. If you reinforce the idea that success is distant, difficult, or reserved for others, your decisions will reflect that assumption. You will hesitate. You will delay. You will reduce your effort in ways that confirm the belief you already hold. And over time, the result appears to validate the original thought. Even though the thought created the result, suggestion operates alongside repetition in a way that is often overlooked. Not every thought you have is your own. Many are introduced, subtly, through constant exposure, through what you see, what you hear, what is repeated around you. And when these suggestions are encountered frequently enough, they begin to blend into your thinking, forming beliefs that feel personal, but were never consciously chosen. You are shown what is realistic. You are told what success looks like. You are reminded, directly or indirectly, of your limitations. And over time, these messages settle into your mind, not as external influence, but as internal conviction, shaping your perception of what is possible and what is not. This is how direction is established without force. Because once your thinking is shaped, your actions follow naturally. And once your actions follow, your results reinforce the original belief, creating a loop that sustains itself without needing to be questioned. But the same mechanism that installs limitation can also install expansion. The same process that conditions doubt can be used to develop certainty. The difference lies in whether you are operating unconsciously or intentionally. When you begin to choose what you repeat, when you begin to direct your thoughts instead of reacting to them, something shifts. Because now you are no longer being shaped by suggestion. You are using suggestion to shape yourself. At first, this may feel unnatural because it conflicts with the patterns that have already been established. Doubt may surface. Resistance may appear because the mind seeks consistency, and anything new is initially rejected. But repetition overrides resistance, and what is repeated consistently begins to replace what was repeated before. If you begin to reinforce thoughts of capability, of direction, of possibility, not occasionally, but consistently, with focus, with emotion, with intention, your internal state begins to change, not immediately, but inevitably, because the mind responds to what is dominant, not what is occasional. Consistency creates dominance. Dominance creates belief, and belief directs behavior over time. This alignment reduces friction because your thoughts, your actions, and your expectations begin to move in the same direction. You no longer rely on motivation to act, because action becomes a natural extension of how you see yourself. And when identity and behavior align, consistency no longer requires effort. It becomes automatic. This is where most people misunderstand change. They attempt to alter behavior without altering instruction. They try to act differently while thinking the same way, and this creates conflict. Because the mind is still operating under the old command, pulling behavior back toward familiar patterns. But when the internal command is changed first, behavior follows with far less resistance. You begin to notice that your focus shifts, that opportunities appear more visible, that decisions become clearer, not because the external world has changed, but because your perception of it has been reorganized by the instructions you have been repeating. The world responds to direction, not desire. And direction is determined internally before it is expressed externally. This is why two people can exist in the same environment and produce completely different outcomes. Not because they have access to different resources, but because they are operating under different internal commands. One repeats limitation, the other repeats possibility. And over time, those repetitions create entirely different realities. Nothing about this process is immediate. Nothing about it is effortless. But everything about it is predictable once understood.